Well, this is a AAA game. It's coming from this big studio, so we know that it's going to have a number of annoying features.
It's just this repetitive, bland look that me and my coworker
make problems
have been
out of
calling
things that aren't
the
problems.
Unreal
You ever
Engine
just go and
Unreal
make
Engine
something in
coding
Unreal
standards.
Engine
What
and
is
then
it?
you realize the thing
they
that you
weren't
just
totally
made
cheap.
in your project
Yeah. And-
undid the other thing that you took forever to make in your project, and then you don't and you don't know what's wrong, and you're just sitting there like, well.
The recent release of Stalker 2 has made two things abundantly clear. The first being that the production pipeline improvements, worker efficiency, graphical fidelity, and performance promises made by Unreal Engine 5 had failed to manifest. And secondly, that Unreal Engine as a production tool in general is something of a hidden curse to most people who touch it. Neither of these facts take away the power of what has been achieved within the game designed by GSC Game World. The game itself is doing amazing things at runtime. Simulated weather, complex environmental physics, open-world exploration on par with Bethesda games, systems-driven immersive simulated reality absent in Bethesda games, hundreds of NPCs behaving with unique intuitive behavior resembling living agents similar to Ubisoft games, and of course, impressive graphics, made possible by Nanite and Lumen. Of course, the steep rendering requirements of UE5's pillars may have proven too steep when compared to the Matrix Awakens tech demo and the UE5 version of Fortnite, both of which released in 2021. It becomes clear that something is missing. Stalker 2 has both 30 and 60 FPS modes. Stalker 2 does not make use of hardware Lumen accelerated ray tracing, falling back like most other games thus far on the signed distance field software method. And unlike Fortnite, Stalker 2's 60 FPS mode struggles to hit its 60 FPS mark most of the time, often bobbing around 50 and even dipping into the low 30s. There's also no sign of virtual shadow maps in any of Stalker's modes on the consoles. This came as a surprise considering efforts from the franchise in the past regularly pushed the boundaries of what was possible in real-time rendering, especially with shadow casting and light rendering. And while moving away from their own technology for the sequel has allowed them to remain on the cutting edge, that edge does not cut quite so sharp as was promised. The lack of the ever-impressive muzzle flash shadows and flashlight shadows being the biggest tell. Stalker 2 is by no means the only Unreal Engine game to suffer this fate. Problems with UE5 and UE4 are ubiquitous in the games industry. Bafflingly slow performance, traversal stutter, shader compilation stutter, texture streaming delays, and multi-threading limitations to name a few. With all these issues, one would think the engine must be avoided at all costs, but adoption of the technology has only grown as the 9th generation of consoles persists. Why? How did this very capable but very challenging engine become king of the hill in game development? To understand this development, a historical perspective is needed. And Unreal Engine's story begins like many other 3D rendering engines, at the tail end of the 20th century. If you're a child of the 90s like me, then chances are you remember what it was like to finally get your hands on a Nintendo 64 and a PlayStation. That magic only grew in scope with the release of the Nintendo GameCube and the PlayStation 2. You no longer had to imagine Mario looking like he did in the cover of the magazines, or on the advertisements. He just looked exactly as he was supposed to. Likewise, you no longer had to put up with blocky character models in Final Fantasy over emoting to express their feelings. Now they could speak and convey with real facial expressions and motion-captured animations. So many ideas that were pioneered during the 5th generation were finally realized and perfected during the 6th generation of consoles from a gameplay and presentation perspective. It is during the 5th generation of consoles on PC that Unreal Tournament and the rendering engine for which it shares its name would manifest as well. In the early days of PC gaming, Tribes, Unreal Tournament, Quake, and Counter-Strike were where gamers went to play online. This reputation was certainly helpful for Epic Games as it moved forward towards Unreal Engine 2. The second iteration of their game engine was released alongside the 6th generation of consoles, and adopted by Ubisoft to shepherd the Tom Clancy brand. Historically though, most creators internally developed their own game engines to assemble their games. Middleware was more commonly borrowed as a component in a developer's game engine rather than an entire game engine by itself. This is where Bink Video, Speedtree, Softimage, and Havoc come from. Of course, every team developing their own tools becomes prohibitively expensive beyond a certain point, which is probably why Ubisoft entrusted Epic's Unreal Engine 2 to be the heart of the Tom Clancy games. And with the arrival of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, the added expense of high-definition rendering tipped the appeal of third-party development tools from a minor potential to a practical necessity, at least for the developers who were not sponsored by huge publishers. Which isn't to say that no developers used another team's game engine. The original Unreal Engine powered several Star Trek games, the original Deus Ex, the infamously delayed Duke Nukem Forever, and the first 2 entries in the Harry Potter series. The number of games that would rely on UE2 rather than UE1 would grow organically, but not explosively. If you played Shrek 2, Spider-Man 2, or Star Wars Republic Commando, you played an Unreal Engine 2 game. It wasn't until 2005 that interest in the Unreal Engine would begin to capture the market, making Bioware's transition to Epic's technology all the more interesting. Anyone who remembers the history of Bioware will know that they got their start making very well-renowned Dungeons & Dragons adaptations. Baldur's Gate, Baldur's Gate 2, Neverwinter Nights, and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, which was essentially a D&D game with a lightsaber. Jade Empire, however, would distance Bioware from its D&D roots, allowing them to evolve their style into their own brand of RPG. What all these games have in common, though, is their proprietary nature. The game engines were made from scratch, and often scrapped and remade multiple times with each new breakthrough in game and graphical design. Even so, their old work was good enough that it would be borrowed for the development of other games, such as the Infinity engine for Planescape Torment, the Aurora engine for The Witcher, as well as the Odyssey engine for KOTOR 2. Mass Effect would be the first game they made using software they had not written themselves. Unreal Engine 3 got its first big showcase in 2005, with the technical demo from the original Gears of War. It would release in the fall of 2006 with exceptional market success and praiseworthy reviews. Numerous Tom Clancy games running 2.5 iterations of Unreal Engine would release that same year. They did look remarkably better than their Xbox and PS2 counterparts, but Gears of War was light years ahead of all of them. It crossed a milestone in real-time rendering. A bit ironic considering it was Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighters that was credited with marking the arrival of the next generation in gaming. Nevertheless, Gears of War would shine brighter than its rivals, showing the advantages of not just programmable shading, but also normal maps, high-density geometry, and high resolution, and the throughput advantages of multi-threading CPUs. It became the standard that numerous other studios, many of whom were exclusive to the PlayStation 3, would work to emulate and eventually exceed. They would of course do so with their own proprietary game engines though. Developers attempting to utilize Unreal Engine 3 would learn very quickly that emulating the results of Epic Games was nearly impossible. This of course would not stop Bioware. The engine was still user-friendly and excellent for realizing new game designs. The passion their team brought to Mass Effect leveraged amazing graphical results. Excellent for their time, even if they fell short of Epic's own internal developments. As Bioware continued to iterate on Unreal Engine, their results would improve, manifesting in what was arguably the best RPG of the 7th generation, Mass Effect 2. Sadly, Bioware was a very exceptional case. Numerous other developers were able to make fun games with it, sure, but they were often ugly and had exceptionally unstable frame rates. Incidentally, the original Mass Effect also had a very unstable frame rate. Only Touchstone's Turok and Rocksteady's Batman Arkham Asylum were able to successfully overcome the pitfalls other developers faced, making Epic Games, Rocksteady, and Touchstone a brief triumvirate championing the capabilities of Unreal Engine. But Touchstone would go out of business within a year after the release of its dinosaur adventure. As the 7th generation gave way to the 8th, Epic would cease its development for the Gears of War franchise to pursue its own new games. Microsoft would entrust the Coalition to carry it forward. Right from the outset, it was clear they understood the Unreal Engine, releasing 4 games in a brief 5-year window. remaking an old property to familiarize themselves with the hardware and then executing one project after another. A feat perhaps only matched by Insomniac games on the PlayStation 5. It would seem a second Triumvirate had formed during the 8th generation of consoles, especially with Epic's earth-shattering success from Fortnite and Rocket League, as well as Rocksteady's achievements with Batman Arkham Knight. Of course, the Coalition's ability to execute would become compromised with the arrival of the 9th generation, and the arrival of Unreal Engine 5. 4 years have passed since the arrival of the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series consoles. They have not released a single game in 4 years. Even during the reign of Unreal Engine 4, it was clear there were massive performance issues compared to the efforts of not just Sony's internal studios, but also the likes of EA with DICE's Frostbite 3, the Infinity Ward engine from Activision, or id Software's id Tech 6. Not only could many of these software suites match, and in many cases exceed, the graphical fidelity of UE4, but often did so at double the frame rate. To be fair, Frostbite 3 had the opposite problem of UE4. It was very fast and very beautiful, but difficult to design for. UE5, much like 3, was very easy to design for, but very difficult to make beautiful, unless you were the Unreal Engine Triumvirate. But even Capcom's RE engine achieved noticeably better results at double the frame rate. UE4's performance issues were so pervasive at the outset of the PlayStation 4 generation that Rocksteady dispensed with it and made their third entry in the Arkham franchise on Unreal Engine 3. Of course, heavily modified to achieve their vision. Anyone who remembers the Samaritan demo for UE3 will also remember its impressive display of atmospheric effects and DX11 tessellation. No one using Unreal Engine 3 at that point bothered to implement those features so effectively. Sure, Arkham City might have used tessellation on the PC, but it was very, very minimal, feeling bolted on after the fact. It was, at its core, an Xbox 360 game. With the release of Arkham Knight, though, tessellation, destructibility, and atmospheric effects were taken into consideration at the beginning of the game's design, with the added benefit of being able to migrate all their animations, assets, AI, and gameplay systems. Even so, development was an absolute headache for Rocksteady, taking 5 years in place of the 2 to 3 of their previous entries. Suicide Squad, unlike the Arkham games, would be designed with Unreal Engine 4, and for the most part overcame all the engine's limitations, open-world traversal issues notwithstanding. Okay, let's just take a moment and appreciate for a minute just how much of an achievement this game was. Pretty much every aspect of the game's presentation, from the character models to the way that the rain and the wind and the smoke and the fog effects came together, was unbelievable. And then on top of that, you have the tastefully done bloom lighting that was not altogether uncharacteristic of prior generation games, but nevertheless gave it an added pop that was especially well refined with the added resolution. You couldn't ask for a better translation of a comic book art style into a video game setting. Pretty much every other game, including the likes of Sony's first-party developers, with the likes of Killzone Shadowfall and infamous Second Son, were substantially inferior in terms of graphical quality. Even Insomniac's Spider-Man, which came out 3 years later, did not compare favorably against Batman Arkham Knight. Both games looked incredible, but one just felt unbelievably grounded and textured in a way that just couldn't be explained. But all the elements just came together in a way that felt correct, that felt well executed. Pretty much the only rough spot in Batman Arkham Knight's presentation was the character models for its women. If you look at Poison Ivy in Batman Arkham Knight compared to Arkham City, she looks noticeably uglier, in a very peculiar fashion. You can't quite put your finger on it, but something just does not feel right. For whatever reason, the translation to a more realistic art style from the second game to the third game just didn't work as well as it did for the male characters. Nevertheless, the animation is still extremely detailed, especially the Batman character model. Everything about the way he moves just felt right. It's a testament to what was possible in the Unreal Engine, the third iteration of the Unreal Engine. It was a graphical achievement that few others would achieve alongside them, and would never really be possible in another Unreal Engine game afterwards, the only exception possibly being the one made by Rocksteady themselves, Suicide Squad. Even so, it still took them a long time to finish their work. In some ways, though, their Unreal Engine 3 work still surpasses Unreal Engine 4. This, of course, does not change the fact that each game engine had its own problems. Problems that would become much more pervasive with each new iteration. Now, let's be honest. We've all encountered that problem that everyone has with Unreal Engine. The fact that all the games pretty much look the same, with regards to how the metals look and how they shine, with how the wood and materials and plastics all look pretty much identical. No matter which version of Unreal Engine you look at, even the skin and subsurface scattering of the various organic elements tend to blend together. The look is so iconic and yet so incredibly infamous that people have even taken to making games out of whether or not a game engine is Unreal or not, because the games that set themselves apart using Unreal Engine while avoiding that Unreal Engine look are so few and far between. But that's just one of the many problems with Unreal Engine. There are so many other problems that exist with the game engine. The biggest problem with Unreal Engine 3 since its early days was the way it struggled to stream in texture data. This problem was mostly overcome for games like Gears and Arkham, but even the original Mass Effect would see moments where textures would be missing sometimes for 5 to 10 seconds after a freshly loaded save. Loading from an installed game on the 360 hard drive minimized this tremendously, but as RAM capacities grew for the PC and 8th gen consoles, it was becoming clear that UE3, even with its numerous updates, was failing to overcome the increasing demands of the new hardware. Remember, developers had a memory pool of 512 megabytes on the 360, but 8 gigabytes on the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. The problem never really went away in later versions of Unreal, and attempts to mitigate it resulted in dumping vast sums of data stored in RAM and refilling it while entering new areas of the map. This resulted in a nosedive in the game's frame rate for a second before going back to normal, an effect that has become infamously known as traversal stutter. This problem would occasionally be mitigated on console releases, but on the PC, even in Arkham City and Arkham Knight, stutters were constantly occurring. It was also becoming abundantly clear that developers couldn't just lean on the much faster GPUs to extract better graphical detail. Historically, they did just that. For 3 whole generations, a much more powerful GPU would be paired with a much more powerful CPU, and the CPU's added speed with a single thread was always sufficient to extract everything that was needed from the graphics processor. They might have had to write more code, but that was the intended outcome. The faster the CPU, the more instructions could be fed to the GPU. The way creators did their work didn't really change, mostly. And things just worked. You could add another thread to do things like physics, and maybe another for things like drivers. With the arrival of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, though, all that changed. The Jaguar x86 CPU cores in the 8th gen consoles, although not weaker than the PowerPC PPUs in the 7th generation consoles, were also not that much of a leap forward. Instead of working with 3 physical cores and 6 virtual cores, on the 360 they were now working with 6 physical cores out of the 8 on the die. This made feeding commands to the GPU to remain GPU bound a less than straightforward process. Everyone moving to 8th gen needed to alter their approach to multi-threading, but Unreal Engine in particular needed to be altered substantially more due to its overhead, which to some extent illustrates the second biggest problem with Unreal Engine 3, its quest for accessibility and flexibility. To make a design environment flexible and accessible, a certain level of optimization is sacrificed. Once the overall vision of the game is achieved, going back after the fact to optimize the experience is a difficult task. It's like trying to remove all the seams of a coat after sewing it together, and then re-sewing it together multiple times. The third biggest problem with the Unreal Engine 3 is the constant battle with being bottlenecked by the CPU. Because the Unreal Engine began its life just before the dawn of the 21st century, it is heavily reliant on legacy code that is fundamentally single-threaded at its foundation. To some extent, every program is single-threaded, because there are certain tasks that need to be done in a specific order, one at a time, waiting for each stage of execution to complete. But numerous other game engines have demonstrated that this does not need to be an obstacle. at least to flexible game development or blisteringly quick GPU performance. Of course, again, the Triumvirate of Unreal learned how to instinctively circumvent this obstacle, even when moving on to later versions of the engine. Another attribute of the game engine that didn't help was the programming language that held it together. It is uncommon, but Unreal Engine is one of several game engines that create their own programming language. Bethesda's Creation Engine probably being the best other example. This game engine specific script is often written at a high level. Theoretically, this simplifies the process of game development, but also lacks the precise control offered by low-level languages. And although the freedom to write code at a lower level is still available, it often exposes compatibility issues with other approaches to game programming. It also means certain aspects of the graphics pipeline are impossible to optimize. Well, supposedly. Again, this doesn't seem to compromise the work of the Triumvirate of Unreal. It is also worth pointing out that a well-made CPU with sufficient single-thread performance would be substantially less likely to encounter problems as a result of these design choices. Sadly though, most UE games could not rely on the PC being their platform of choice. The easiest thing to criticize about Unreal Engine 4 is the way it didn't really do much to solve the problems that existed on Unreal Engine 3. What it did do was take a bunch of research with NVIDIA about emerging techniques in GPU acceleration, and eventually make its own proprietary version of physics called Niagara. In addition to a much more seamless implementation of geometry tessellation, initial showings of UE4, much like UE3, showed lots of promise. It basically took the strengths of UE3 and fortified them. Games like Gears of War and Unreal Tournament 3 were the intended trajectory for Unreal Engine 4. Remember, Epic's Unreal Tournament was one of the 4 most popular games at the dawn of the internet, so their intent to focus on online-heavy games like Fortnite and Rocket League made sense. Although the PlayStation 4 generation, the 8th generation, began this way, developers began experimenting with the viability of open-world design, and numerous game developers had adopted Unreal Engine 4 by this point. On a PC, this would not have been an issue, but the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, as similar as they were to PCs, had roughly 1/10 the CPU performance, at least compared to that of the Intel i5 and i7s, which were the only real choice for PC gamer enthusiasts until 2017. So, countless UE4 games intended to be open-world or immersive sims found themselves plagued with performance issues on the 8th gen consoles, because they were CPU-bound. Epic would work to mitigate this by migrating CPU tasks to the GPU. Most efforts, though, like in UE3, never really lived up to the graphical potential promised in their initial tech demo. The best example of this was Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, compared to Star Wars Battlefront 2. Even though Fallen Order was released 2 years after Battlefront 2, the latter looked better than the former. This was incredibly telling, even after numerous opportunities for optimization on a mature gaming platform. It still couldn't beat a game that was 2 years old by the time it was released. Jedi Survivor, on the other hand, did manage to look better than Battlefront 2, but it needed the 9th generation consoles to do so. Ray tracing, image reconstruction, and a 30 FPS cap. Around this time it was becoming clear that the Unreal Engine had a big new problem developing too. Shader compilation stutter. Shader compilation stutter is a problem that uniquely developed as the PS4 began to transition to the PlayStation 5. And while Unreal is not the only engine to have this problem, it has had the largest impact given how many developers create with it. Games on consoles were not affected by this development, but virtually every gaming PC in existence was. Most Frostbite games were able to evade this issue by including a brief compiling shader step during the loading process for each level. id Tech 7 also handled this problem elegantly, and took advantage of most of the features the 9th generation consoles offered. Ray tracing, variable rate shading, extreme CPU multithreading, image reconstruction, tessellated geometry. It did it all at 60 frames per second too, and at a 4K resolution. And it's only a matter of time before they support mesh shading and sampler feedback streaming to further optimize their rendering pipeline. Then came Unreal Engine 5. Before we go any further though, let's take a moment to look at how Unreal Engine's adoption rate has trended since its inception. Roughly 10 games were made on the original Unreal Engine since 1995. Roughly 65 games were made with Unreal Engine 2 since 2001, to approximately 235 with Unreal Engine 3 since 2006. Unreal Engine 4 is almost double that. It came out in 2014, and more games are still being released today with the technology. That's quite a lot of developers waiting to get their hands on the 5th version of Epic's rendering software, which made its debut in 2020. The initial demo, Lumen in the Land of Nanite, looked phenomenal, and ran on the PlayStation 5. But none of the games that would eventually be released on consoles looked that good. Not even close. Punctuating what was becoming a trend at this point. Promises of fidelity unmatched by others being curiously unattainable unless you're the Triumvirate of Unreal. This is where The Matrix Awakens and the updated version of Fortnite would take center stage, and they delivered exactly what they promised. Nanite, virtual shadow maps, and Lumen, software and hardware, at 30 or 60 frames per second. Okay, let's pause for a moment real quick just to acknowledge some very unsettling attributes about The Matrix Awakens demo. Yes, the demo is awesome. It's great what they're doing in terms of real-time rendering with regards to Lumen, and Nanite, and virtual shadow maps, those 3 sacred pillars of Unreal Engine 5 that were mentioned previously. And in some cases, they successfully replicate what seems like the film footage from the Matrix films. But when Keanu Reeves does his whole spiel about what is real and what isn't real, they're very clearly moving from live-action recordings to a character model rendered in real time with keyframe animation. And the animation, more than anything else, gives it away as not being live action. The character model itself is pleasantly detailed, but the fact that it doesn't move correctly is deeply unsettling and gives that unbelievable sense of the Uncanny Valley. This is only exacerbated when they move to young Neo and young Trinity, where if you get a good look at their cheeks, there are so many moments where their character models feel overly blurred or overly noisy, or weirdly washed out in terms of their textures. Weirdly enough, the PlayStation 5 Pro doesn't actually make this problem go away. It actually makes it worse. It's ironic to think that their anti-aliasing solution combined with the low input resolution on the PlayStation 5 actually hid some of the flaws in their character model design. Yes, they do get pretty close to matching what the actors looked like when they were young, but they clearly didn't add the polish necessary to really sell the notion that it was the same characters from the movies. Unreal is not just in the game engine, it's in the very look of the game. Trinity's character jokes about everything seeming a little unreal. Well, the joke is on them as much as it is on the audience. Because as close as the character models get to photorealism, they are still just a hair's breadth short of being exactly what they need to sell that effect. And because they're a hair's breadth away, the quality of the rendering appears much more unnatural than it should. All I can say is thank heavens Hellblade 2 doesn't have this problem. All other UE5 games released on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series consoles are missing at least one of UE5's advertised graphical features. Immortals of Avium was the first AAA game outside of Epic's own efforts to make use of all of them, and at 60 frames per second. Unfortunately, the version of Lumen they used was not hardware accelerated, and the resolution on consoles was horrifyingly low. Senua's Saga, on the other hand, was a complete outlier. An exceptional outlier. Not only is it the best showcase of Unreal Engine 5 to date, it's also the only game in history to reach out and touch, not grasp, touch, photorealism. If real-time ray tracing is the holy grail of real-time graphics, photorealism is its arc. No, not that arc. Alan Wake 2 got pretty close. So did Cyberpunk 2077. Both games needed path tracing and well-endowed gaming PCs to do it though. Hellblade 2 did it with an Xbox Series X. It was also running on version 5.3 of Unreal Engine. Black Myth Wukong ran on 5.0. The Matrix Awakens demo ran on 5.0, Fortnite ran on 5.1, Immortals of Avium ran on 5.1 and was then upgraded to 5.2. Stalker 2 ran on 5.1. On the one hand, it is important to keep in mind that the scale of what GSC Game World has accomplished is well beyond any tech demo or free-to-play game made by Epic. On the other hand, Epic's work has been and always will be intended to signal to other developers what was intended to be the standard of quality across the industry. Unreal Engine 5.4 promises to deliver everything The Matrix Awakens offered at double the frame rate. Running the Matrix Cityscape on Unreal Engine version 5.4 versus 5.1 seems to prove this to be the case, which is encouraging, but thus far no developers have started using 5.4, let alone made a game that matches the detail in the Matrix demo. Running the Matrix Cityscape in Unreal Engine on version 5.4 versus 5.0 seems to prove this is the case, which is encouraging, but thus far no developers have started using 5.4, let alone made a game that matches the detail in the Matrix demo. This clear contrast between what is promised and what was eventually realized represents not just a troubling development for game creation, but rather an uninterrupted pattern on part of these shepherds of the Unreal Engine. They've been doing this for nearly 20 years now. So the safer bet is to expect the performance profile seen in the initial demo to become more stable 3 years later, rather than double the frame rate. To be clear though, these problems have not been solved for anyone in the midst of development on an earlier version of Unreal Engine 5. So this problem is only going to get worse. The problem is already so bad that YouTube videos are emerging expressing their discontent. Seizing upon this discontent are some really smart people, demonstrating how the conventional wisdom in Unreal Engine design has fundamentally shot itself in the foot regarding optimization, over-relying on techniques like TAA and its upscaling variant to hide their failures among other things. Now, as much as I hate to accuse developers of being lazy, I have to admit this is sometimes the case. This is evidenced by the fact that so few developers have done any work to remove shader compilation stutter. So why wouldn't it be the case with things like over-reliance on temporal effects, or memory management, or poor management of GPU compute, or quad overdraw? So let's revisit our question at the start of the video. Why has the adoption of Unreal Engine become so dominant in the games industry? The simple answer is that game development has become so complicated and so expensive that most studios just cannot keep up with the demands of maintaining their own software development tools. A deeper elaboration revealed some alarming trends. When the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were released, a development budget of $2 to $5 million would guarantee the greatest possible production values a game could hope to have. That was at the dawn of 3 dimensions in video games. Team sizes very rarely grew above a dozen members, unless that game was Final Fantasy VII, which had a team of over 100 men. By the time the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox released, team sizes had risen to 50 members, and cost of development increased to $25 million. By the time of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, 100 plus team members were required to make a game. And while the average game cost roughly $50 million to make, the most ambitious games topped $100 million easily. By the time the PlayStation 4 released, $100 million was the norm for AAA budgets, and team sizes exceeding 200 were much more common. The theoretical limits of the hardware grew with each generation, but so did the manpower and resources required to reach them. PlayStation 5 games are ranging between $200 to $300 million. And unlike previous systems, the problem is no longer, can the hardware do what you want, but rather, can you assemble the manpower to get the results that you need for your vision? The 5th generation of consoles was the N64 and PS1. Getting a grip on 3D was challenging enough at the time. The 6th generation, the PS2 generation, introduced dense polygon modeling, allowing characters to emote naturally, and although the GameCube and Xbox supported programmable shaders, support for the technique would not become universal until the 7th generation, with the release of the 360 and PlayStation 3. The 7th generation was also the generation that introduced multi-threading. Not much changed with the 8th generation apart from adding more threads to the CPU and adding geometry tessellation to the GPU. GPU-accelerated physics and particle effects were added too, but were minimally supported. The 9th generation added ray tracing. It also added mesh shading and variable rate shading and sampler feedback streaming, and rudimentary machine learning. Most of these features, like GPU acceleration, have not received support yet. And the reason why is simple. Taking the time to write the unique code to properly support each new feature takes time. Time that sometimes puts them beyond the reach of a current project. It's hard enough keeping track of all the bugs for conventional code written on a CPU, but now you have to learn to program the GPU and then wrap your head around a subset of accelerators on the GPU as well. It's important to again reiterate that although the programming pipeline for real-time graphics had not changed, the amount of code to contend with was growing, rising from tens of thousands of lines to the millions, making debugging line by line exceptionally challenging, even with analysis tools. The introduction of multi-core added another level of navigation and complexity to an overwhelmingly growing challenge. Taking that in conjunction with the new layers of rendering added to the graphics pipeline with each new generation of graphics meant that all the work used in their approaches to graphics needed to be redone from scratch each time. Well, maybe not after the introduction of the Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 coincided with numerous development trends on the PC. Many high-performance game engines that already leveraged modern graphics rendering on the PC could move from 360 to Xbox One with minimal challenge. After all, the Xbox One was a low-end gaming PC for its time. This, of course, did not minimize the growing complexity and heterogeneity of GPU developments. When moving from PS1 to PS2, special teams were devoted solely to writing low-level graphics code to keep pace with the GPU's multiplying circuitry. And although these teams grew moving from PS2 to PS3, the nature of the GPU had not fundamentally changed yet. As stated before, the introduction of programmable shading, while effective, only really added one step to the process of rasterization. The PlayStation 4, however, was a complete paradigm shift. Its GPU had so many more moving parts that specialists among the specialists needed to be hired just to ensure the proper function of those newly added features. With the arrival of the PlayStation 5, more moving parts were added still. If time to triangle is just 2 to 6 months for the GPU itself, imagine how much longer it takes to get one of its unique accelerators to work halfway decently. Keep in mind, the benefits of most of these features are minimal at best, at least in isolation. When taking all that complexity into consideration, as well as how much time, money, and manpower goes into building, and then maintaining it, it makes sense why many developers would rather forego these expenses and challenges. Game development is already expensive enough. It is already labor-intensive enough. Why not outsource the rendering engine to a third party who already provides the same service for numerous other companies? It's the path of least resistance. And choosing not to maintain your own game engine is another expense you no longer have to pay, and can now reinvest into the quality of your game. Unreal Engine has also done a lot of work to push into the movie industry. While attending university, whether for cinema, visual effects, or video games, Unreal Engine is the default game engine most developers are trained on. So all this together makes it ideal for your average development team seeking to make a game. Well, in theory. As mentioned previously, Unreal Engine 5 has numerous problems. The funny thing about Unreal Engine 5 no one likes to talk about is the way Nanite works. Clearly trying to do things both ways was not a good idea. Lumen was cool, and so was Nanite when it was first introduced, but the funny thing about Nanite was that in its earliest iterations, it did not play well with traditional methods of rasterization. Sure, it virtualized geometry so that you could have infinitely dense amounts of geometry on screen at once, but combining that with a classical approach also caused immense balance issues in terms of how the processor tried to manage its resources, causing the frame rate to tank. And while there were ways to manage this problem, as demonstrated by the Coalition, it was also clear that the simple nature of the new techniques created problems for the way people made their assets. Creating new assets for a game now took longer than ever, even with techniques like photogrammetry. So not only did it crush performance in order to get that exceptional level of detail that people craved, it also counterintuitively, but perhaps naturally, made game development longer. Remember, the promise of Nanite was that now you no longer have to waste time making a whole bunch of baked normal maps and authored LODs. You no longer have to make lower polygon versions of a particular asset to save on performance. You just make one version and boom, you're done. But actually designing the art in that initial phase to begin with would now take longer than ever. So in the end, the work it promised to save ultimately wasn't saved. Supposedly, each new iteration of Unreal Engine 5 solves one of these problems. Unreal Engine 5.1 added a threading option to cut down on shader compilation stutter. In addition to a pre-compilation step, 5.2 would add procedural support for level design, removing potential bottlenecks in addition to substantial improvements to hardware Lumen. Now, finally, hardware Lumen could run almost as fast as software Lumen. 5.3 added vegetation, animated, and shape warping geometry to the Nanite pipeline, removing another potential obstacle to smooth performance. Unreal Engine 5.4 added much more substantial multi-threading support to the engine, doubling the speed of moments under intense CPU load. That Matrix Awakens demo, as stated before, runs twice as fast on the same hardware. 5.5 introduces a much more focused adjustment to Lumen's dynamic lights, allowing surfaces to be more or less illuminating based upon how bright or dark the emitting surface is. It also now permits character models to be rendered with nanite instead of traditional LODs. This is great, but it's just not enough. It ultimately fails to address many other problems that have existed in Unreal Engine since it became the engine of choice. Problems that have been ignored and continue to be ignored. If we're being honest though, the years Unreal became the engine of choice was just the moment those problems became acute. They were always there at the beginning. The real problem with Unreal is that it's still a mid-90s program, with more and more layers stacked on top of it year after year. Theoretically, there's nothing wrong with that. It works for the initial team that made it, as well as their family of developers. What about everyone just being licensed to the technology, though? As the engine becomes more dominating and more ubiquitous, the incentive for the creators of the engine to address these problems begins to dwindle. Yes, Epic Games has achieved a lot. Yes, they've pioneered some amazing techniques. Yes, they've made some amazing games that push the boundaries of the medium. Yes, they've even fixed a few of the problems with Unreal Engine 5. Nevertheless, they are now the industry's biggest obstacle to fostering creativity and preventing homogenization. The situation with Abode is very instructive concerning the developments with Epic Games. For the longest time, Abode was the best choice. Then Abode was the only choice. When it became the only choice, it became a liability, not an asset. Then, in time, open source, free-to-use tools through quick iteration and community support became more compelling than the standard upheld by the status quo. Fortunately for us, there will always be options outside of Unreal Engine. As long as compelling alternatives exist, there will still be hope for the future long term. In the short term, things are very bleak. So many game creators use Unreal Engine, and so many of their games have neglected the maintenance required to give the player a truly compelling experience, devoid of distractions and immersion-breaking artifacts. The best we can do is hope that developers can execute their vision for their games with the tools they have available. And who knows, there may be a few good implementations of Unreal Engine 5 on the way. Perhaps the recently announced Marvel game, 1943: The Rise of Hydra, will be a step in the right direction. Unreal Engine 5 isn't going anywhere. We can either abstain from buying the games or support the developers who try their best to make the most of the tools they have available, as well as support alternatives. That's the best anyone can do. Thank you for watching.